Hey folks, I'm trying to get these episodes out as soon as I can. Here's another great episode I did recently with Daniel on his new book, The Case of the Crimson Test Suite and Swift Testing. Hope you enjoy it. I'm really excited about going to server-side Swift at the end of September. Daniel will be there too. He's given a great talk on macros. If you're going to be in the area, I highly recommend checking it out. There's a discount code, Empower Apps, all caps, one word. If you put that in, you'll get 15% off. So definitely check that out. I'll put that in the show notes as well. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Bye, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Empower Apps. I'm your host, Leo Dion. Today, I'm joined with Daniel Steinberg. Daniel, thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure.
This is the second time you've been on the podcast.
Second time? I think we talked about functional last time.
We did. Yeah. Well, before we jump in, I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself.
Okay. I know a lot of you. I see a lot of you at conferences. I tend to write books and do contract coding and teaching both at conferences and privately on iOS and macOS topics.
Speaking of functional programming, where do you think that is right now in a somewhat post-combined world?
That's a good question. In some ways, we're seeing more of it in Apple APIs. You're seeing maps and filters and things all over the place. You still see them in, for instance, async sequences. So you still see a lot of the things we did in Combine have surfaced in other places. So I think we came to terms with the fact that, as we knew, Swift wasn't really a functional language, but we could do functional things with it. And I still like to code that way a lot.
Yeah, same here. Yeah, that's a good point. I feel like if anything, we still have, Combine's still around, obviously. But if there's anything we still have from that is a lot of, you can see traces of it in the way, functional programming is everywhere with anything new that comes out, including the async sequence stuff. So yeah,
that's a really good point. One of the problems, though, is that, functional programming works best with value types, and we've got that emphasis to use value types, and value types work best with async and all that. And yet, Swift UI is pushing us to use more reference types on the back end for observable and for Swift data and things like that. So it's a bit of a mixed message between Swift and Swift UI. And so with Swift, it's easy to use functional. With Swift UI, it's a little harder.
Yeah, that's true. That's a really good point. Yeah, and on top of it, we have like non-copyable types, which is a whole other like Pandora's box.
I don't understand them yet, so.
That makes two of us. Okay, so today we're going to talk about Swift testing. Kind of, I guess, give the overview of Swift testing, what it offers alternative to XC testing, and what have you liked, what have you disliked about it, I guess.
That's a lot. So the first thing is what attracted me to it. Every once in a while, something gets released and it just feels like something I want to get involved in. I want to write a book about. I want to understand it better. In Swift testing, not only did I like the APIs, but the way the team has worked through the process, the support they've given the community through docs, it's just been really, I think, a model project from Apple. And so it's been nice to see.
What I think, and I'm gonna just say I'm ignorant, but like,
me too. What is Swift? Even after I've written a book.
I went into the videos and I'm like, okay, what is this offer that XC testing has? And I do like the fact that it's pure Swift for 100 reasons, but like, I'm not sure it offers, what does it offer that XC testing doesn't already offer outside of the fact that it's not tied to Objective-C?
So I don't know if you remember when Steve Jobs came back to Apple, but when Steve Jobs came back to Apple, there were all sorts of devices that Apple was selling, all sorts of Macs. And Steve said, no, we're going to simplify the line. We have Pro, we have Consumer. we have laptop, we have desktop.
Mm-hmm.
And in my view, that's one of the biggest things that Swift testing brings is it says, we're going to simplify. There's not 1,000 XCT asserts you have to know. You set things up, and then you either expect a result or you require a result. And then, so that's the one axis. And then the other axis is if you expect it to succeed, that's great. If you expect it to throw an error, there's an expect throws or require throws. And so the expectations to begin with are so much easier to work with.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. When you say expectations, are we talking about like, from what I remember with XC test is like, you basically have like the ability to wait for an expectation. Like if you have something that gets called into closure, for instance, is that what we're talking about when we say expectations?
No, the expectation that I'm talking about is the equivalent of the XCT assert true, XCT assert equal, XCT, all of those. And so instead of that, we have a pound expect, and the pound expect accepts a Boolean where you say this thing equals this thing. And so everything in Swift testing is a macro. The at test that decorates the method or the function is a macro, and the pound expect is also a macro. The at test is an attached macro, excuse me, that decorates the method that it modifies that it's attached to, and the pound expect is one of those freestanding macros that expands into all the things that we need. So there's a lot less ceremony, which is kind of nice.
Yeah, that you could definitely say that. What if somebody wants to jump into it? What's the first thing that they may be overwhelmed by, or that they may feel intimidated by that you think helped you get into Swift testing?
Well, actually, what made it harder for me and for those of us that looked at it right away was it wasn't integrated in Xcode, and we had to do things to make it work. All that is gone with Xcode 16.
Right.
What made it hard from the command line with Swift packages was we had to add a flag to Swift test to make it work. That's gone with Xcode 16 beta 5. And so a lot of the things that made it hard to get your feet wet with are gone. And that's really nice. As for writing your own tests, it depends on if you're coming from XC test or not. If you're coming from XC test, then you're used to creating some class that subclasses from something, and then you have to write the name of the methods a specific way, and things execute a specific way. And so one of the things that might surprise you is your first test can just be a free function. It doesn't have to be part of a struct or class or anything.
Do you think that do you think it's going to be easier to like organize tests and make them a little bit more readable in Swift testing? That's the biggest benefit I've seen.
Well, so the Swift testing team has given us several axes to do that with. So if you have a test, you can name it anything you want. I tend to prefer terse names. But then if you want to see a more descriptive name when you run the test, you have the freedom to create a display name. So in the at test, one of the arguments is, how do you want this to appear? And that's a display name as a string. And then you say, well, I've got this test here and this test here and this test here that I want to group somehow. Do they have a common reason for being? I can create a tag. And now I can run all the things with a common tag. Oh, do all these things belong together conceptually and hierarchically? And I want to use the same setup for them. I create a struct, which is a suite, and I can name that suite and I can provide different things there. And so there's all these ways of organizing your tests that are very handy.
How about, sorry, I'm trying to remember. How do you keep your tests organized? Like, are you doing like your just functions out in the main file, or are you setting up structs, or what do you suggest if you want to keep your tests organized in a fashion and using your display name properly and stuff?
So I use a mix. Some tests can run on their own. Some want to be organized into a suite. I almost always will use tags. You can use, which we didn't talk about yet, suites within a suite. And so one of the nice things is, so if I'm building a calculator, as I do in one of my running examples, and I have all these things that are testing the stack, but inside of there are ones that test the stack and they also test the display, I might create a struct within a struct that does those. And now I can run those separately or all together. The problems with Swift testing are generally not with Swift testing, they're limitations of Swift. So for example, if I have a property in my outer struct and I want to view it from my inner struct, you can't. And because we don't create the setup code, I can't even pass it in. And so you do have to duplicate some of the setup if you're doing a struct within a struct.
Okay, got it. What are some other benefits that you saw with Swift testing over XC test?
So one of the things is out of the box, tests automatically run in parallel, in random order. And so
Nice.
you don't get these issues where, oh, I didn't expose that issue because my tests always run in this order, and maybe I've got some dependencies that I don't remember. On the other hand, there are some tests that you might want to run in a specific order, and there's an easy flag, they call them traits, that you can set that says run these as serializable. And so that's a nice handy thing that you can do. The serializable ones, one runs then the next, and so that might increase your time. You're not getting the parallel. The other thing is they play nice with async. And so I can have async tests, and to your question from before, like I can do an XC test, but so much easier, I can require that a test completes in some amount of time. So I can say,
okay.
I don't want to wait forever for this, but I can run something that is actually async.
That's awesome. Like the things like I get like frustrated with XC tests is, like you said, it's a lot of boilerplate code. Like, is there even like an idea of like setup and teardown in Swift testing? Really? Do you even need it?
You can, but what happens, for example, if I have a suite that contains 4 tests, what happens is a separate instance of that suite, of that struct, is created for each of those tests, and they are run separately. So you're not getting the cross-contamination there. I don't have to worry about the setup and the teardown there. So maybe I have just an init for my struct if I need to set up fancy things, but for the most part, I'm just adding a property and giving it a value, and that's all the setup I need.
What so one of the things, and we had a question or comment in Twitter from someone, behavior tree said it needs in-source testing, better snapshot serialization where you can omit fields content for dates, IDs, etc. One thing, that I've heard a lot of is just like, well, that was one of the things I was expecting, is like the ability to do mocking, things like that like are difficult to do in Swift, basically because we don't have the dynamic abilities that we got in Objective-C. And I was looking forward to maybe like some macros for that. Where do you see that stands for things that people want? Do you think there's going to be kind of a community around that, or do you think it's just not something that's necessary as much as people say it is?
I think both sides of that. I think in general, when something doesn't do something you want, you can both question that it doesn't do it, and you can question whether you really want and need it. Are you doing something that you need to do? There are some things that Swift testing doesn't do yet. For example, it explicitly does not do performance testing. It explicitly does not do UI testing. And so these are things that are excluded. The other thing is, this is a first release. And as a first release, I find it very robust. In fact, it isn't even released yet in a way. It's in September when Swift 6 comes out that we'll see, oh, now it's released. So there's a side of me that when people complain, I just want to say, come on, people.
If you were, that was one thing I wanted to mention, is that it does require Swift 6, correct?
Yep.
And it's delivered as a Swift package, which is really great. It's like basically it's all open source, I would assume, right? So
it is open source, and you can submit issues there. It's in Apple's it's an Apple's repo on GitHub. The team is amazingly responsive. If you publish on social or you participate in the forums, the team members have been just amazingly responsive and helpful.
Are they keeping it under the Apple organization, or are they going to move it to Swift Swift Lang by any chance?
I think it's on Swift, or I think it's
It
going
is
to
Swift
Swift
Lang.
Lang.
It is
If
Swift
it's not
Lang.
there yet, they announced that it was going to be.
Yeah. No, it is right now, as of the recording. So yeah, that's awesome. Definitely check that out. Really great documentation here. One other thing. So do you think, like, what other things do you think are missing that you think the community could use in Swift testing? Like, either you could use additional or you feel missing from XC testing.
What I found a lot of with my early experiments with Swift testing is if something isn't behaving, it's often something the team knows too. So I'll give you a fun example. I'm writing the book, and I have this example where I'm serializing. And the whole reason I'm serializing is just to demo this thing that they have. Generally, you don't want to serialize your tests. You want them to run in random order.
Right.
And they're failing. They're not running in random order, but they're not running in the order I expect. And so they're running first and third. And all of a sudden I realize they're running in alphabetical order of the method name. But it turns out the team already knows that. They fixed it. And in the next release, there it was. In fact, they'd known it before I'd encountered it. It just hadn't made its way through the release cycle. So sometimes these things that we run into, it's not a limitation of the framework. It's that sometimes things aren't correctly implemented yet.
Right.
The things they've thought about are deep. Now, there are some lacking, and there's good reasons for the lacking. So I don't know, have you worked with Swift macros at all?
Yes, I've written one Swift macro.
So one of the nice things about Swift macros is you can create tests for them. And they have a really nice test template for XC tests where you can say, here's what I typed in, here's what I expect it to expand to, and even if something fails, here's how I expect it to fail. There's an issue with Swift testing with that because you can't get a cyclic dependency to have things work out. So you can make it work with Swift testing. I am, excuse me, I am updating the macros book to accommodate that, but it's we're all encountering this together. And so I don't know if you remember the early days of Swift UI, but part of it was a lot of engineers internal at Apple weren't using this thing in anger. And so they weren't realizing what needed to change about it. And you saw in Swift 2 and 3, as they started using it internally, they said, oh, you guys were right about the navigation view. It needs to be something stronger. And now we get a navigation stack. I think the same thing will happen with Swift testing as more internal people use it.
One thing we didn't mention, and I think is a huge benefit of Swift testing, is like the data-driven stuff, where you can like set up a series of structs and say these should result into these. You know what I'm talking about? I'm not sure the exact terminology.
I think what you mean more is the parameterized testing.
Yes, that's exactly what I mean. Thank you, Daniel.
So for the parameterized testing, instead of writing, 5 tests that essentially do the same thing, but each one takes a different piece of input, you can say, okay, here's these pieces of input, put them in an array, and say that this test depends on these arguments, and now it'll run them. And what it does is very clever. This single test will create 5 instances of the test, one for each of the inputs. So if one fails, you can see it. You can see what went wrong. You can fix the issue, run the wrong test first, and then run all the tests to make sure it's fixed for all of them. The other thing is, say you have 2 axes, and so you want 2 arrays. And so if I have 2 arrays, what it'll do is it'll create tests for each combination. And so if I have 5 in the first array and 4 in the second, I get 20 tests.
Wow.
Now, that's the limitation. Unfortunately, I can't put in a 3rd array. So the limitation is 2 arrays. And at least at this point, the warning if you put in a third array doesn't say that that's what you've done wrong. It's calling out something else. But if you try more than 2 arrays, but you can get clever and you can zip 2 together, or you can group them differently, or have an array of tuples if you want. So there's many ways around it. I don't find it a deep limitation. Again, if you're wanting to do more than 2 arrays, you may need to ask, do I really need to, or is there another way to look at it? And what they're trying to prevent is it's so easy for us to feed in so many arrays, and now we've got an explosion of tests, and often there's so much redundancy that why are you taxing the system like that?
Yeah, that's a fair point. If you were going to start a project, let's say you're going to do an app, would you go with Swift testing or would you go with XC test?
I would go with Swift testing, but I tend to do almost no UI testing. My UI layer is very thin. And so if I've really tested the model and what I still call the controller layer, the view model, the presenter, whatever you call it, if I've really tested those properly, then the connection of the UI to those, I don't really test that much. But if you've seen my apps, the designs aren't pretty. And so I'm not looking at screenshots to see if things look right. In fact, I will say, thank goodness for tech reviewers. In a previous example of my calculator app, I had no 4 and 5 buttons. I had 2, 2, and 3 buttons. So maybe I need some UI testing.
Nice. And so you would go, it requires Swift 6, right? So if you have to use Xcode 16 basically if you're going to do Swift testing, right?
But if I'm creating a new project, that's what I'm going to do. You said if I'm creating a new app, what would I do? The other thing is, if I'm creating a new package, I would absolutely do it in Swift 6, because one of the nice things in Swift 6 is you can mix Swift 5 and Swift 6 packages. So if I'm creating a new package, I do it in Swift 6, I use Swift testing, and I'm not doing much UI in a package anyway. So I'm feeling pretty good about that. And one of the really nice things Apple did with this transition to Swift 6 is package by package, they can be Swift 5, Swift 6, and everything works well together.
Yep. Yeah, that's awesome.
I know, I sound like such a fanboy.
With Swift 6 or Swift testing?
With all of it.
I know. I mean, yeah, you would totally go on board with Swift testing as far as moving forward. There's nothing you miss from XC test at all.
So I was a fan of behavior-driven development, not test-driven development. And that's the given, when, then type of setting. So years ago, I liked the sort of the Kiwi, the cucumber type of testing frameworks. XC test was kind of like a port of the old JUnit, not even what JUnit has become. And
that's a Java unit testing thing?
Yes.
Okay.
And so the other thing is that Xcode, as much as I really like Xcode, there's some things that Xcode has never done that makes testing much easier. So for instance, IntelliJ, for I think 20 years, since the old Java days when they were first getting started, had this thing where in a test, if you said, I want to test that this class has this method, and it didn't have this method, IntelliJ would say, well, do you want me to stub it out for you? And there's no reason that Swift, which is strongly typed, and Xcode can't do that for us now, but it doesn't. And that makes testing so much easier if you really want to do TDD and drive your development with tests. And so I tend to do more test my things as I create them. I don't drive it. But one of the key features of testing for me is not that I'm testing the app, but I'm writing API that consumes the thing that I'm creating. And so it's the first code that I write that consumes this new thing so I can look and go, well, I don't know, like the way I call that method. I'm calling it from a test, but what it means is then I go in and I change the way I call that method. I change its name, I change its parameters, I make an invisible label so that I'm not having to call a label, colon, whatever. And so to me, one of the big benefits of testing is design.
I agree with that 100%. Yeah, because like it's you're testing the interface, but it's like the interface of the code, right? Like it's not like it's like now you get to see it in actual use and you're like, yeah, I don't like how that looks. And yeah, that makes total I like that analogy a lot. It sounds great. I definitely want to dive back into it again, and see some stuff that we can that I can do with it. And like you said, as long as you stay with Swift 6 and Xcode 16, then you're pretty much good to go running it. And there's no issues running, like it works on Linux too, I would assume, right? As far as
I think that's right. I don't want to swear to it because I haven't tested it on Linux.
yeah.
I mean, one of the things I like is with packages, you can also run it from the command line, and the reports you get in the command line are really nice. So one of the limitations was, I said before, if you tag something, you can run just the tags. Currently, you can only do that in Xcode. But
oh, really? You can't do it in command line?
You can't do it in the command line, but the team has said, oh, we see a way forward, and it's something they're considering for a future release, and that'll be nice. The other thing from the command line, and this isn't a Swift testing limitation so much as the way things are built, if I want to test a project, not a package, I have to specify a lot more things. I have to tell you what the scheme is, and I got to tell you what the target is. And so that's not as simple as just typing Swift tests.
Yeah, right. Overall, what's been your impression of what's come out from DubDub this summer? Obviously we've talked about Swift testing, but has there been a lot of like new APIs or new OSs that you've been interested in over the past few months?
Well, clearly Apple's push is the move to Swift 6 and getting complete with the async APIs. And so that's clearly their push. I think if you read between the leaves, app intents are going to be very big.
Yeah.
It's not something I'm playing with much yet, but it's clear that what they're offering now is telling us you need to start using these. These are going to become more important. Apple Intelligence, I don't know how much is shipping in the betas, but I'll tell you, yesterday I went for a walk and I forgot to turn off that I was walking, and I drove home and it said that I walked 8 miles in an hour, and that was awesome.
Yeah, we've all had those before. Have you used any of the betas yet?
Or whatever would say, hey, you're going 30 miles an hour. Maybe you're not walking anymore.
Maybe you should, apply to the next Olympics, I guess, with that kind of speed. Did you have you installed the beta on anything yet?
Yes, because I'm an idiot. I've installed the beta on everything. So okay. I made it to Thursday of DubDub week before I put it on my phone. I put it on my iPad right away.
Okay.
And so it's been on my carry device. I have a separate partition where I'm running it on my Mac.
Oh, see, I'm more stupid than you because I'm running it right now on this Mac that I'm recording. I'm running 15.1, so I'm even crazier. But then, of course, my iPhone is still on, what is it, 16? Yeah, 17, right? So, have you done 18.1 yet? Like played around with Apple Intelligence on the phone?
I've not played around with it. As I said, if it was there, I mean, it should have told me different things. So I have it on the phone, but if it was there, it should. I'm not convinced.
You think? Yeah, right.
But I feel very strongly that for me, AI is not LLMs. LLMs is a separate discussion, and I'm not really interested in LLMs. I'm very interested in what Apple can do with AI and ML, because I look at what Photos does with ML, and I think that's a compelling use case.
Yeah, and I think that's a big problem, is that AI has become LLMs essentially in marketing speak, and Apple has been ahead with like other forms of AI. Like you said, photography is the big one, right? Where like they've been doing photography stuff for years. And other things that they've done with the watch and various things where they've detected things. I mean, the Vision Pro is a great example of that. But now it's like the total focus is on generative and LLM, and it's like I don't know. We'll see how far that goes. I wouldn't say I'm a skeptic, but like there's only so much LLMs and generative can do
Well, I'm
when
going
it
to say
comes to that
you're a
stuff.
skeptic.
You're gonna say I'm a skeptic. I'm not a skeptic. I think there's big benefits, but it's not gonna we're not gonna have HAL next year. So a little bit like I don't think it's the revolution people think it is. Let's put it that way. I don't know where you stand on it.
I think there are things there. I recently gave a keynote at Swiftcraft, which talked about how do you look at all these things that come out at DubDub and decide what's for you? And for me, it's a combination of things that are interesting. So Swift testing was interesting, but I also have to find my place in it. And so Swift testing, I find my place in it is it's something I want to teach, it's something I want to explain, and it's something I want to use in my own code. Before I wrote the book on Swift testing, I used it in my shipping apps. And so,
Okay.
The ones that I sent to test flight using Swift 6 have Swift testing in them. But for AIML, it's interesting. I don't see where I fit in there. Because in order for me to do it, I need access to big, clean data sets. And that's not something that I, as an indie, usually have access to.
Let's. I really like that topic. Because you talked about that too in Chicago on Deep Dish, where you were like, you talked a little bit about it, where you're like, oh, I wrote a whole book on Combine, and like, well, your talk was specifically about Swift data, right? But you talked about like Combine, you loved Combine, you jumped into Combine, and then like, it's been crickets for ever since Combine came out. And then now they came out with this new thing, Swift data, and it's like, like, without giving
So
away
one
your
of the
whole
things I
talk.
said was because Swift Data had come out last year, and Deep Dish was about a month before DubDub, and what I said
Right.
was, I like Swift Data, but before I tell you to dig into it, I would see what Apple does with it at this year's DubDub. If there are no sessions, if there's no changes to the APIs, then I would be wary. And Combine was sort of my warning that Combine was a
Canary in the coal
beautiful
mine.
framework. It was
Yeah.
great to use. I got a lot out of it, but it clearly was a step, maybe not intentional, but it was a step along the way to async. And once they made the step towards async, and even async sequences aren't something that are pushed as much as I would have expected. Async sequences initially looked like a replacement for at published. And then we moved quickly to async. And so my only caution there was make sure you're seeing a commitment from Apple into these things before you go in. There was a year, if you're old enough, you remember, there was a year where we were going to have garbage collection on the Mac. And then we weren't. So just sometimes the people who aren't able to implement what's new because they have support 2 back, sometimes they're in a great position because they get a couple of years to see if something is going to stick or not, if something's going to become as important as it looks when you're seeing that first presentation that is so attractive and enticing.
Yeah. What did you think about Swift data this year? Because we just got history stuff, right? Like, is that sufficient for you to feel like, oh yeah, Swift data is the future, or are you a bit like,
I didn't get some of the things I wanted.
Okay.
I wanted to see a more powerful predicate, for example.
Yeah.
I wanted to see that it could be used outside of Swift UI better because, for example, I don't like this move to us getting rid of the controller layer. I prefer to have the controller dealing with a lot of this and then lightly updating.
Yeah.
I'm writing a lot of controller code and model code in my view now, and I don't like that trend. So I was hoping we get more support for outside of Swift UI. One of the things we did get is a very nice support for previews. And so the new
Yes.
macro that helps us, I implemented it as a macro. The new support we got for previews is very nice.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I mean, like, so in my app, I pretty much have gotten rid of query in SwiftUI just because it doesn't do what I want it to do. And I've moved all my Swift data stuff to observable objects, like the controller, essentially, right? And yeah,
So
I
how
just
are you
find
getting updates from Swift data that you then reflect to the?
you're not gonna like this answer. I use Notification Center. So there's a way to, like, because underneath, right, it's just core data. And so I use the core data notifications to basically know when something is updated. And then I have basically a bunch of like listeners set up. And then that's how I know when the data has been updated. I think I did
By
it
the
at some.
way, did you see the announcements of what may be coming to Notification Center? This is, I think, big news.
Okay, go ahead.
A notification cannot be sendable because a notification is a reference type and it contains a user info dictionary which can contain anything.
Oh God,
And
that's
so
the bane
this,
of my existence is these dictionaries with any's. Yes. Anyway, sorry.
So there's this new proposal to have this notification. I don't remember if it's notification center.message or notification.message, which is sendable. And
Okay.
it's a great solution to use with async. And now I can use Notification Center in a very powerful way and not be sending things across actor boundaries and getting all those warnings.
To me, like the bane, like that, like I don't want to get into a Sendable rant, but like the fact that there's so much old code that's like NS object based or any based that's like there's no way to tell if something is sendable or not. It's just been a real pain in the butt. So yeah, that's gonna be awesome.
Well,
But
one of the nice things, if you have architected your app, which I tend to, using lots of packages, you can address those one package at a time and update one package at a time. And I find that very powerful.
yeah. So speaking of Swift data, that's kind of what I'm in the middle of right now with my app, my VM app Bushel, is the fact that I ended up having a session and they're like, yeah, you can't do persistent model, cannot be sendable. I think we've even talked about this offline, but so now I have to change a lot of my code to basically take into the fact that it cannot be sendable and do everything in closures or grab the persistent identifier. And that to me has been a big pain in the neck. Is like, to me, so I would think Swift data would be even more friendly to async await considering how new it is, but it's like kind of not. And I think we specifically talked about the fact that like why are models classes and things like that.
And that's what I was going to say is that's the difference between the Swift team and the Swift UI team is Swift data I thought would have been the opportunity to make these things value types. And then they would have been easier to send. Although we might have gotten into issues with non-copyable, but it would be nice to be able to send these things across. And so you end up sending sort of a representation of them so that you can get updates.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm doing is just grabbing the persistent identifier and using that. And then kind of copying the fields. But that's like it feels like so awkward and it could be so easily like done another way. Like I get that it's a class because underneath it's a reference to some SQLite file somewhere, right? But at the same time, like
know that. We shouldn't
right,
care
right.
about that.
I know. I'm agreeing. Yeah.
So all of what you just said, I've lost my thought. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I mean, like I kind of think like that's what I feel like they're trying to push away from classes as much as possible and get everything to be a non-copyable struct or an actor. It almost feels like that's kind of the trend in a lot of ways.
So a lot of what we have to do is put things on the main actor, and it looks like we're putting a lot on the main actor until you actually go through debugging or look at instruments and you find out that things are pushed off the main actor when they can be every time you hit an await. And so
okay.
at first it feels like we're putting everything on the main actor, and why isn't this slowing things down? But when you dig into the async, sometimes you find out, yeah, but when the system can push things off to a background thread, it's happening for you.
Oh, okay. That's really interesting. Makes sense. Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about your Swift Craft talk that you did in England a few months ago. Um, macros macros are one of those things where I'm afraid Apple invested a lot into it, and then kind of like we haven't heard a lot as far as making building at macros better. But then at the same time, we do see a lot of macros everywhere whenever they can. Where do you see the future of macros and where they're headed?
So one of the problems with Swift evolution is we see everything that's being added to Swift, and we think everything is for us. And some of the things aren't for us. Like
Right.
you can go through the rest of your life and never write a macro and still benefit from macros. Pound
Right.
preview in Swift UI is a macro that got rid of so much dumb boilerplate code. It's, in my opinion, the perfect macro. And so Swift testing at suite, at test, the tags are at tag, pound expect, pound require. These are all macros. And so I'm using it all the time. Do I have to be writing my own? And also the ones that we write, as opposed to the ones that Apple writes, we have to bring in Swift syntax, which slows down a clean build. And so although I liked writing macros and I still write macros, I don't think they're for us primarily. I think they help make the environment we live in better. But before you write your own, you really should question, can you do it any other way? Could you do it with a function, for example? Could you do it with a protocol? And so if there's another way to accomplish what you want to accomplish, then don't reach for a macro. Macros are great when they are used for what they should be used for.
What do you think is a great example of when you should create a macro? Like, do you have like a checklist of like?
So okay, my example was pound preview, because if you think of pound preview, before pound preview, we had to come up with some name, and we tended to name it whatever the view was underscore previews. We had to conform to something. Conforming to that thing meant we had to implement something. And so we implemented this computed property inside of this struct. And all we cared about was, what are we presenting in the preview? Pound preview says, type pound preview and give me the thing you're presenting. End of the day, that's a beautiful macro. That's a great use of macro. So in Swift Data, for example, they gave us a way of creating something that would present data in a macro. And most of what we have to type in is nonsense. And I would have done this in a function, except if you give me a function that accepts a variadic, inside the function, it's transformed into an array. And I can't then turn around and call Apple's function that requires a variadic. So I had to create a macro. And so I created a macro that makes adding preview data really trivial and gets rid of a page of this boilerplate, which is just, it's not that it's not important, but it's non-interesting and it never changes.
Do you think at its core, macros are a way to bring the dynamic abilities of Objective-C into Swift, essentially?
I don't.
Okay.
I think that the dynamism of Objective-C is very powerful and a runtime thing.
Right.
So a macro is a compile time thing.
The reason I'm saying that is, like, with Objective-C, you could change stuff on the fly all the time. And like, there's certain things you could do with Objective-C reflection-wise, for instance. And it seems like with macros, it's a way of like basically changing a certain type on the kind of on the fly, but not really, like by basically modifying the code. Because
Yes,
it's
but
before
again, I
it's
want to
before
stress that
compilation.
it's a compile time issue. It's not
Right.
this change isn't happening at runtime, and that's what I would
Right.
say
Right.
is
Obviously. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
well, it's not obviously, but it needs to be stated, right? Because
Yeah.
that's
Sorry.
Objective C. We could do stuff at runtime.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. That's a good point. Before we close out, you got books. You got a book coming out specifically on Swift testing. Do you? We'll put a link. You'll have a pre-order link that we can
Yep.
share with our audience. Okay, awesome. Do you have any other books coming out? Probably
So
updates, right?
I have both books and I have updates. What I'd like to do is make sure that my books are still relevant. So I updated my Swift intro book for the last time. I've end-of-lifed it, but it now works in Swift 6. I
Okay.
don't think the intro material will change. I'm going to write a Swift 6 book, which is for sort of that next level stuff. What have we gotten? Not just in Swift 6, because a lot of what we call Swift 6, we got in Swift 5.9, 5.10, 5. It's been evolving towards this. And so I want to talk about that. Just because I'm an idiot, I don't know if you've noticed, my last books have all used sort of a detective theme. And so I've had this running detective story. The Swift 6 book will have a Winnie the Pooh theme because of the Winnie the Pooh book. Now we are 6, of course. Now we are Swift 6, and so
right.
I'm looking forward to playing with that. I have to update my async book to Swift 6, my macros book to Swift 6, my data flow and Swift UI book to Swift 6, and I may also update. It should be a light update, the functional book and the Swift UI Kickstart, and those will be end of life with those updates. But the async book, the data flow and Swift UI, and the macros book, those will continue to live. I'll continue to update those.
Awesome. And we'll put links to those in the show notes as well. And then you have a bunch of conference appearances you'll be making, mostly Europe, I think, right?
Mostly Europe. I'm just a stranger in my own land. But so the easy answer is, if I'm at a conference, it's because I was invited. If you ask me, I generally say yes. And so if I'm not at a conference, because I wasn't invited. And so I'll be going to Swift Island and iOS Dev UK. Nice. Those will probably be before this post. I'm doing a Swift testing workshop at iOS Dev UK and then at NS Spain. And I'll also be doing a talk at NS Spain on macros and another talk on macros at server-side Swift at the end of September. And so awesome. Busy time coming ahead. And then finally, in October, I hope to see you in Bologna for PragmaCon, which is just also, these are all just such great conferences, great community, and amazing organizers.
And I will see you in London for server-side Swift. I will be doing my talk on how to server-side Swift work out in the real world. And I literally mean work out because it's a fitness app. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. We'll have links to all that stuff in the show notes.
It'll be great to see you there, and maybe we'll do a meal together.
I know. Yes. I know lox and bagels. Like now, I'm like addicted to it. Thanks to you. So, Daniel, thank you so much for coming on. This was fantastic.
My pleasure.
Where can people find you online?
Dim Sum Thinking pretty much everywhere. dimsumthinking.com includes links to everything I do, and then on socials, I'm blah 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 Dim Sum Thinking.
Yep. Awesome. People can find me on social media at Leo G. Dion, at Leo G. Dion, at c.im on Mastodon. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. As you can see, I'm in... Can you see? Let's see. No, maybe not. I'm moving, so I don't know when this episode will come up, but hopefully soon. Where it's still relevant. So, yeah, that'll be my busy project for the next few weeks. Thank you, everybody, for joining me, and it was good to see you. Bye.